Thank you, Your Honor. Counsel, lady and gentlemen of the jury, on January 5th, 2019, over 5 years ago now, Provo police officer Joseph Shinners went to work and never returned home. Joe experienced every police officer's worst nightmare when they put on the uniform and the badge. He was killed in the line of duty. The evidence will show that on the night of January 5th, 2019, while Joe and fellow officers from Provo and Orem police departments were attempting to arrest Matt Hoover, he, the defendant, shot and killed Officer Shinners. This is a photograph of Officer Shinners, taken around the time before his death. Joe was shot in the parking lot between Lowe's and what used to be called Bed Bath & Beyond off University Parkway in Orem. Some of you might be generally familiar with the area. The evidence will show that Matt Hoover shot Joe with a purple .380 Ruger. Joe was shot in the chest, essentially center mass. About right here is what the testimony will show. Tragically, the bulletproof vest that Officer Shinners was wearing that night did not catch the bullet. It must have been pushed to the side or pulled down. I'm showing you now, ladies and gentlemen, the gun in question. This is the purple .380 Ruger. And you'll hear extensive testimony about this particular weapon from fact witnesses as well as expert witnesses. The bullet from the .380 tore through Joe's chest, through his left lung, before it exited his back. It caused significant internal hemorrhaging. Dr. Eric Christensen, the medical examiner who performed Joe's autopsy, will provide you with the details. In summary, his testimony is going to be that Officer Shinners' cause of death was a gunshot wound to the chest, and his manner of death was homicide. Officer Sam Lass of the Orem Police Department was the first officer to notice Joe struggling. Joe was found kneeling on the asphalt where he had retreated to after being shot. Officer Lass attended to Joe's wound, and he will testify that Joe told him, "I'm hit," and then began to spit up what appeared to be blood. Those words, "I'm hit," were the last words that Joe uttered before later dying at Utah Valley Hospital. I'm going to show you now a couple of photographs. This is a photograph of the scene. You can see a white truck, and you'll hear extensive testimony about that truck. That's where the homicide took place. And you can see some evidence markers on the wet pavement here, the asphalt. And if we could zoom in, there's an evidence marker towards the back here, C, going right there. The next photo shows what appears to be the blood that Joe spit up when he was speaking with Officer Lass. Now, it's significant to note that the defendant, Mr. Hoover, was also shot that night in the stomach when Joe returned fire within a second or two after he was shot. The defendant, of course, survived, though, which is what brings us here today in this trial. Judge Powell has instructed you that this is an opening statement. It's an overview of the case from the perspective of the prosecution. But what I say as an attorney in this case, and what the defense may say, is not evidence in this case. The evidence is the sworn testimony that you will hear and any exhibits received into the court by the judge. Those items are typically tangible items, like the gun, for example, clothing, photographs, and video. The testimony and the exhibits are the evidence that you will ultimately rely on when you deliberate on the facts of this case, apply the law, and render judgment. I urge you to pay careful attention to the testimony you hear and to the exhibits that are received into the court, as together they tell a very important story. You've also been instructed on the presumption of innocence and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are legal doctrines and standards that the prosecution supports. We, the state of Utah, bears the burden of proof. You should also keep an open mind throughout this trial. It's not until the end of the trial that you will be allowed to discuss the evidence collectively as a group and reach a verdict. And as jurors, you've taken an oath to well and truly decide the issues pending between the parties. This is an important case for obvious reasons for the state of Utah, for Mr. Hoover. And we trust you that you will take your oath seriously, and we thank you in advance for your service in this trial. You're going to hear testimony from dozens of witnesses in this trial. And because it's a rather lengthy proceeding, we've had to accommodate the schedules of some of our witnesses. And so at times it may seem to you that the testimonies coming in, the story being told, is somewhat out of order or maybe disjointed. For that we apologize, but in order to get all of our witnesses to testify, we've had to accommodate some of their schedules. You're going to hear testimony from a number of police officers who were on the scene that night, and you'll watch a lot of body cam and dash cam. Some of the testimony or video may seem repetitive or even duplicative, but each offers a unique angle or insight that we think it's important for you to see and to hear. The state of Utah, we want to present all that we have for you so that you understand and see the entire story before your deliberations in this case. With that said, you will learn that police officers' body cam and dash cam recordings themselves do not tell the entire story. Body cams provide one view straight ahead. And if that body cam is attached to the officer's chest, it provides a view at chest height. If it's at the officer's shoulder, it's closer to eye level. It's also important to note, though, that body cams don't work on a swivel, sort of like you and I. We can turn our heads. Body cams don't turn as officers are turning their heads and looking at the scene. We're able, as human beings, to take in so much more of the scene because of that. So there are limitations with the camera, the footage that you're going to see. Also, body cams can fall off the officers' uniforms, which you will see had occurred in this case. Similarly, the audio recordings on officers' body cam footage may not capture every sound, as multiple simultaneous sounds can be lost in the recording because they're being made at the same time, on top of or over each other. And objects pressed up against body cam can obstruct the audio or make scratching noises that muffles the recorded sound. In other words, despite the amount of body cam and even dash cam that we'll present to you, the testimony of the live witnesses that were there and what they observed is very important in this case. Back to the scene on January 5th, 2019, that night. You're going to quickly learn that the situation presented to law enforcement was chaotic at times and very fluid. Circumstances were changing by the minute and sometimes even by the second. While Joe is obviously not here to provide his perspective, you will hear testimony from former Lieutenant Jared Barney. Lieutenant Barney was with Joe that night. Lieutenant Barney has since retired from law enforcement, but he will be here to testify in this trial. Lieutenant Barney and Joe were riding in the same vehicle and working this case together. Barney will testify about the planning and the efforts to coordinate with Orem Police the arrest of Matt Hoover. Law enforcement was very interested in arresting the defendant. Specifically, You will hear testimony, watch dash cam and body cam footage of officers converging onto the defendant's truck, where he was found sitting in the driver's seat and where a woman was found sitting in the front passenger seat. This woman was a confidential informant, or as a CI, as they're called. She was working with law enforcement that night, helping them to facilitate the arrest of the defendant, Mr. Hoover. Law enforcement attempted to pin in the defendant's truck with their vehicles, after which they exited their vehicles and approached the defendant's truck. You'll see on body cam footage officers, including Joe, Officer Shinners, yelling commands at the occupants. Their weapons were drawn. They were wearing their police uniforms with badges displayed on their chests and patches on their sleeves. And the red and blue lights from the police vehicles were activated. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the coat that Officer Shinners was wearing that night when he was shot. As you can see here, there's a badge on the front. His name, Shinners, stitched on the front. On the sides, there were patches, Provo Police Department. On the back, in bold, all-cap lettering, police. You'll have the opportunity to examine this evidence as well as jurors. Officers were ordering the occupants of the truck to show them their hands and to open the doors. The evidence will show that the woman in the front passenger seat, the confidential informant, was compliant in raising her hands. But the defendant wouldn't fully raise his hands or open the doors. You'll hear testimony from the woman in the front that the defendant, Mr. Hoover, was yelling at her not to open the doors. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is a still shot of officers surrounding, of some body cam that you'll see officers surrounding the vehicle. You see one officer here in front that happens to be Jared Barney, another officer here, and then of course the officer that's with the body cam that's showing this. You can see the badges, you can see their guns were drawn. Despite the fact that it was night, you can also see that the area was relatively well lit. Officers were pounding on the windows and attempting to break in and open the doors. And while the defendant's truck was surrounded and was seemingly pinned in by the officers' vehicles, the officers themselves, and the Bed Bath & Beyond building, you'll see where this truck was parked. The defendant was nonetheless able to put his truck into reverse, ram a police vehicle behind him. At about this point, Officer Edward E.J. Estrada of the Orem Police Department jumped into the truck through the passenger door that had just flung open. He found himself on top of the woman trying to gain control of the vehicle and also the defendant. You will hear testimony that Officer Estrada was grabbing at the defendant's right arm, trying to stop him from putting the truck into gear. The gear shifter was located on the steering column of the truck. But as testimony and body cam will show, the defendant was still able to put the truck into gear and drive forward. Officer Estrada then began punching the defendant in the face with his right hand. As the truck went forward and sideswiped the Bed Bath & Beyond building, jumped some curbing in the parking lot, and then a short distance later, it came to an abrupt stop. When the truck stopped, Officer Estrada stopped punching the defendant. Officer Shinners, who had been at the windows of the truck yelling commands, gave chase on foot as the vehicle was fleeing, the truck was fleeing. You'll see him trip at one point and fall to the ground. Once Joe got to the truck, he also entered the open passenger door. At this point, there were 3 people crammed into the passenger side of the cab of that white truck. Officer Shinners, no, it was shortly after that that the defendant produced with his left hand that purple .380 Ruger that I showed you, pointed it in the direction of Officer Shinners. Officer Estrada was also there. The woman was still in the vehicle, pinned underneath those officers. He pulled the trigger, fired it, and shot Officer Shinners. This is another photograph of the vehicle, the defendant's truck. Of course, that shows the driver's door open. But all of this occurred just right inside the cab of this vehicle, right here. Officer Shinners and the other officers made entrance through this side of the vehicle before the gunshot. The next image, ladies and gentlemen, is a still shot from some video taken by Delene Ostler. Ms. Ostler will testify that she and her husband were passing by that night on University Parkway, and they noticed the commotion that was going on. They noticed the lights, the police officers overhead, red and blue lights. They stopped and she recorded the scene. As you can see on this recording, this still shot, you see Joe kneeling down and it looks like he's grasping at his chest. Right here. That's Officer Shinners. This is the truck in question. That's where Officer Shinners had retreated after being shot. Now, as part of Officer Estrada's testimony, as a reminder, he was the one that jumped into the truck first and was fighting with the defendant's right side. He'll testify that he did not see the defendant's gun until after it was fired, at which point his attention immediately shifted from the defendant's right arm and hand trying to stop the vehicle from going forward and fleeing. His attention immediately shifted to the gun, the defendant's purple .380. Officer Estrada grabbed hold of the gun, pinned it against the driver's side door along with the defendant's hand. Officer Estrada's testimony will be that moments after the defendant fired his gun, he saw a second gun in his peripheral vision on his right side, which was Officer Shinners' gun, fired around into the defendant's stomach. It was basically a contact shot, meaning the muzzle of Officer Shinners' gun was pressed up against or in very close proximity to the defendant's stomach. After a brief struggle with the defendant over his gun, while he, the defendant, was continuing to try to pull the trigger with his left hand, Officer Estrada was able to gain control of the gun and hand it over and back to Lieutenant Barney. Lieutenant Barney had come up on the vehicle and he took possession of the gun, and you'll see that on some body cam footage. Now, some of the evidence in this case may not be easy to listen to or to watch. Officer Lass, for example, will testify about his interactions with Joe that night. When he arrived on scene, he was the first, again, to see him struggling as he was kneeling down on the asphalt. He approached and attended to Joe. Officer Lass also helped transport Joe to the hospital. He helped bring him over to Lieutenant Barney's vehicle, get him into the back of the vehicle, where he then got in, and Lieutenant Barney and Officer Lass took Joe to the hospital. It was a 2 minutes and 56-second ride down to the hospital that night. Lieutenant Barney's body cam captures the video and audio of this ride down to the hospital. You'll hear Officer Lass on the body cam say things to Joe like, "Stay with me, all right? And stick with me, brother. And keep those eyes open for me. Keep those eyes open." And when Officer Lass tells Lieutenant Barney, "You gotta go, man." I mentioned previously the woman who was found in the front passenger seat of the truck. She's the confidential informant, or the CI. She will testify about working with law enforcement that night to set up this meeting for officers to arrest Mr. Hoover. Again, they were interested in locating and arresting him. This confidential informant will testify and describe as best she can what happened in the lead up to this encounter between Joe and his colleagues in law enforcement and the defendant. She will testify about what happened inside the cab of the defendant's truck. It has been 5 years since Officer Shinners' death, and this confidential informant will tell you that she's done her fair share of drugs in the meantime. When she comes into court, she's going to be shackled, and she's going to appear in a prison jumpsuit. You will hear testimony that she was paid by law enforcement for her help that night. You will also hear about her history as a confidential informant working for the police, and also about her personal criminal history. During this case, you're going to hear from a number of expert witnesses. One, for example, is Justin Shaver of the Crime Lab. He is a ballistics expert and will testify that the spent bullet that tore through Officer Shinners' chest, his left lung, that exited his back, was indeed shot from the purple .380 Ruger that was taken off the defendant. Mr. Shaver will provide you with the details of his analysis and his expert opinion. You'll hear from Amanda Neely of Utah County Evidence. She'll testify about finding the bullet that killed Joe embedded in the back of his bulletproof vest. You're going to see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that this really isn't a whodunit case. The identity of the shooter in question that shot and killed Officer Shinners, it's not really in question. The primary issue for you to resolve when you ultimately retire and deliberate on the facts of this case and apply the law is what was going on inside the defendant's mind when he shot and killed Officer Shinners. As part of this case, you're going to hear from a witness. Her name is Terry Hoover. Ms. Hoover is the defendant's ex-wife. While they were divorced, they maintained a close relationship and frequently talked. About 2 days after the shooting, Ms. Hoover spoke with the police, and she told the police that 4 months before, the defendant told her when speaking about the police, "I'll have to shoot them if they come after me." And when she reminded them that police officers have families, he replied, "I would kill myself then if they get me and I can't get out." You'll hear from other expert witnesses in this case, like Amberly Saunders and Lori Abbott. Ms. Saunders will testify that the alleged methamphetamine that was found in the defendant's jeans that he was wearing that night indeed tested positive for methamphetamine. Ms. Abbott will testify that the blood drawn from the defendant that night tested positive for methamphetamine. You will hear from West Jordan Chief of Police Ken Wallentine. Mr. Chief Wallentine is an expert in the use of force in police work. He will testify about his education, his training, and experience, and more specifically, he's going to testify about felony stops and the force commonly used during those stops, the general dangers facing police officers, especially during felony stops, the fluid and unpredictable nature of circumstances facing officers when they respond to calls and arrests, and the extreme time compression in which officers are required to make decisions in the face of uncertainty and danger, and the need to adjust their tactical and execution plans under intense time pressure. You'll also hear from Justin Sightsinger, a cell phone forensics expert. He will testify about his analysis of a cell phone seized from Matt Hoover's truck that night. You will hear testimony and see evidence that this cell phone was located by crime scene investigators inside the defendant's truck, below the steering wheel, at the feet of where a defendant was sitting when he shot Joe. Remarkably, the phone was still plugged into the charger despite the chaos of the scene. This is a photograph of inside the vehicle taken that night. As you can see, there's a marker, number 18 there, but just to the right of that, you see the cell phone that's still plugged into the charger. To the left of the marker, just below, you see a spent shell casing. And actually below the phone, that black device is a body cam device. And that's actually Officer Shinners' body cam that had fallen out during this incident. Had fallen off, excuse me, during this incident. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the actual cell phone that was located inside the truck that you see on that photograph there. You'll hear testimony about this phone. As part of Mr. Sightsinger's testimony, again, he's the cell phone expert, you'll hear that on the morning of January 5th, 2019, the very day the defendant shot Officer Shinners, that posted on the defendant's Facebook account using this very phone to make the post was the message in all caps, F-U-C-K, the cops. Excuse me, F-U-C-K, the police. With a very disturbing image behind it. A photo of a horse seemingly trying to sexually mount a police officer. This, ladies and gentlemen, is that post. Mr. Sightsinger also found that on the morning of January 5th, 2019, again the very day that the defendant shot Officer Shinners, that also posted on the defendant's Facebook account using this very phone again to make the post was the message in all caps, "Never push me to violence. I've been waiting for an excuse to use it," with the image of the Joker from a Batman movie. That's the image. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm getting close to wrapping up the state's opening statement. But before I do, I'd like to leave you with a recommendation that I think will help you in your efforts to ultimately reach a just and true verdict. When you were sworn in this morning, you committed yourselves to truth and justice. That's really what this is about at trial. Let me begin by giving you a metaphor to consider. This metaphor is an anchor. Anchors can be defined as heavy objects attached to a rope or chain used to moor vessels to the sea bottom. But in reality, there's all kinds of different types of anchors. At first thought, we might think that the weight and design of an anchor is what makes an anchor most effective. But after a closer look, that's generally not the case. Weight and design are important, but what's most important in making an anchor effective is in securing an object or securing a vessel at sea, is what the anchor is attached to or anchored to. For instance, most of us here, I think, are familiar with the little plastic wall anchor devices that we pound into our walls to hang paintings or photographs or mirrors, for example. These anchors are small and weigh next to nothing, probably less than a half an ounce. I've learned that if I drive one of these small little anchors into a half-inch piece of sheetrock, it'll secure an object of up to 89 pounds. That's significant for the size of that anchor. But I've also learned that if I drive that same little plastic anchor into a concrete block, it will hold up to 875 pounds. Ladies and gentlemen, as jurors, your concrete block, if you will, what you need to anchor yourselves to are the facts presented during this trial and the law given to you by Judge Powell. 2, your common sense. And 3, the truth. As you begin to listen, to watch, and to understand the evidence in this case, and you anchor yourselves to the facts and the law, your common sense, and the truth, you will reach a true and just verdict. It has been 5 long years since Officer Joe Shinners was killed. 1,882 days today. Closure seems to be finally on the horizon, at least some measure of closure. Ladies and gentlemen, when the time comes at the conclusion of this case, and we're given the opportunity to give our closing arguments, we will ask you to shine a light, a bright light, on what happened inside the defendant's truck on that cold, dark January night in 2019. And we will ask you to convict the defendant on all counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grunander, for the opening statement from the state. Ms. Corcoran, Mr. Nish, does the defense wish to make an opening statement at this time? Mr. Grunander, I'll ask you to retrieve your exhibits here, please. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Nish, when you are ready. Excuse me.
All right, let's get one thing perfectly clear and out in the open as we begin this trial. Matt Hoover tried to shoot himself on January 5th, 2019. Himself and nobody else. He did not intend, nor did he attempt, to shoot Joseph Shinners. That is what the evidence is going to show, and that is what the case is going to be about. My colleague did a good job of laying out the basic facts of the case for you. Some of the evidentiary issues you're going to see, how it all ties up. And somewhere in his colloquy, he told you that state of mind is going to become the issue. And he's absolutely correct. And the judge has also already instructed you that what we call mens rea is the fancy lawyer term for it, but it means state of mind, or what somebody is thinking when they do a certain action is going to become central to this case. The judge's instruction to you has already been given, and if you wouldn't mind, take a look at instruction number 2 in the packet that you've already been given. Instruction number 2 gives you the elements, what we call elements of these particular crimes. And I draw your attention to the second line of count 1, that the defendant, Matt Frank Hoover, did intentionally or knowingly cause the death of Joseph Shinners. As this case progresses, every question that you ask yourself, every piece of evidence that you analyze, every witness that you listen to, I need you to come back to these 2 words: knowing and intentional, and decide if the evidence will get you to that state of mind. That's what needs to be paid attention to. Now the state, as you can see here in the information you've got, the state has elected as the governing body to charge Mr. Hoover with aggravated murder. And Mr. Grunander told you himself that they take upon themselves the burden to prove that. And it is their burden. They accept it willingly, they understand it. They must, beyond a reasonable doubt, prove that Matt Frank Hoover did intentionally or knowingly cause the death of Joseph Shinners. That's the burden. And they have to prove every element. In other words, it's not enough, or will not be enough, that the state prove that Mr. Hoover was in possession of a gun. It will not be enough that the state prove that the gun was fired. It will not be enough that they show that the firing of the gun hit Officer Shinners. And it will not be enough that the state prove that Matt discharged the weapon. And that is a fact we actually dispute, and we will discuss that later in the trial. The case will come down to 2 words again: knowingly and intentionally. So the state's burden is to show that Mr. Hoover fired the weapon with the intent to kill Joseph Shinners, not the intent to kill himself, the intent to kill Joseph Shinners, that was the purpose of producing and firing the weapon. And the evidence is going to show that that is not the case. And anything short of that, or any intent other than that, will result in a legal mandate to find the defendant not guilty of that charge. So what the evidence ultimately going to show is that Matt had made a decision. He made a decision he wasn't going to go to jail. Now, a lot of us don't necessarily understand that decision. It's not a position we find ourselves in on a daily basis. You're going to have to judge Matt as he is. But that was a decision that he had made, and he'd made it months prior to the events in question. He would not go to jail. And as a result of that decision, he made a second decision, that if he got into a situation with the police where he could not escape, he could not get out, then he would have to kill himself. That was the decision that he made. And like many decisions that we make in our lives, when we make the decision in advance, it becomes much easier to do it in real life. We teach our children, make the decision now that you're not going to do drugs, because someday you're going to be presented with drugs. And if you make the decision now, it makes it much easier to not do the drugs. Just a simple example of what I'm talking about. Now, the evidence that was encompassed by the state's opening doesn't cover any of that. Doesn't tell that part of the story. But that story is going to come out. It's going to come out through several witnesses. You're going to hear that that decision had been made. You're going to hear that that was the purpose for carrying the gun, to ensure that if he got into that situation, could not get out of the situation, that he had an exit that maybe none of us understand, but that was his exit. That was his choice. He had made it. The evidence regarding that actually goes back several months. Matt had made that decision. He had communicated that decision to loved ones and people that knew him. Other people knew that if he got in a situation he couldn't get out, he was going to kill himself. The evidence will also show that he had even attempted suicide on at least 2 prior occasions. So the decision itself wasn't particularly difficult for him to have to execute. He'd already made it. He'd actually already tried it. But not in a situation where it was for him and what he perceived to be life and death. So the plan was to kill himself only if he got cornered and could not escape. Further evidence will show regarding Matt's state of mind. You'll hear about another encounter that Matt had with law enforcement. Coincidentally, 2 of the same officers you're going to hear testimony from and hear about in the January 5th incident. That first encounter was a few months before the night Joseph Shinners was shot. Officers Harrison and Estrada encountered Matt in a storage unit. And Matt did not give them his true identity. They figured out who he was by running his license and his registration on his truck. And they attempted to arrest him. But he got into his truck, locked the doors, turned on the truck, and he fled. But this time he got away. During that flight, while officers Harrison and Estrada were chasing him, he made a phone call. Made a phone call to Terry, who you've already heard about from my colleague, telling her basically goodbye. This is the situation we talked about, and if I get cornered, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to kill myself. I got the gun, I'm going to kill myself. You'll hear testimony to that effect. For safety reasons, the pursuit was eventually called off and Matt did escape. And I put it to you that you don't escape from Utah County Police without negative consequences coming down the road. And that event started a snowball of events that got us to where we are today. I'd also point out that the events of that day and the events of January 5th have a lot in common. You're going to hear these 2 stories. You're going to hear the same set of facts, that Matt was in his truck in both occasions, that Matt had locked the doors on both occasions. Matt was approached by law enforcement, told to get out on both occasions. Matt put the car into drive and fled on both occasions. The key difference between the 2 that you are going to hear is that in one incident, he escaped. So no gun was produced, no shots were fired, nobody was injured. And in the second incident, he did not escape, could not escape. So the gun was produced in an attempt to kill himself, and it just didn't go the way it was supposed to. On January 5th, as my colleague has already pointed out to you, the police wanted to do this so badly that they engaged the confidential informant. They used her as bait to lure Matt into a situation where there was an ambush he could not get away from. You're going to hear that this operation was barely planned and was extraordinarily recklessly executed. The evidence will then show that Matt responded exactly the same way he did the last time. Again, tried to flee. This time, too many officers, too many police, tighter situation, could not flee. As my colleague already told you, 2 officers eventually jumped into the cab of his truck, Officers Estrada and Officer Shinners, who is, of course, the decedent in this case. This is the same Officer Estrada who Matt Hoover had escaped from months earlier. And as was already pointed out to you, he was beating Matt senseless, hitting him in the face until it was clear to Matt that he was not going to escape. So Matt produced the gun to shoot himself in the head. And before he could get the gun to his head, it went off and struck the second officer, Joseph Shinners, in what we believe was the left armpit area. And Joseph Shinners would eventually die from that wound. The evidence is going to show, however, that it is very possible that it was Officer Estrada who caused the discharge of the weapon. And I'm going to need you to pay attention to that when the time comes. But as we go, again, I want you to just focus on the instructions and the law that the judge has given you. He's already given you a preview of the law. You're going to get a lot more as the case continues. But the state must prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Matt Hoover knowingly and intentionally fired the gun with the intent to strike and kill Joseph Shinners. And the evidence is going to show that that's simply not the case. We're grateful for your service, and I join my colleague in that. We are grateful for your service. We too have waited nearly 5 years to present this evidence to you. At the conclusion of this trial, we are going to come back and we're going to ask you to hold the state to the burden that they have already accepted. We're going to ask you to judge Matt's mental state at the time of this event. We're going to ask you to make a finding that he was trying to kill himself and that he did not knowingly and intentionally target, shoot, or kill Joseph Shinners. But that was a very horrific byproduct of an attempted suicide. You're going to hear evidence as well about the grief and sorrow that even Mr. Hoover feels about the incident here. Granted, we know it's not going to be the same as other people, but there is grief there. You're going to hear about it. When you've heard all the evidence, my partner and I are going to come back and we're going to ask you to make a series of very difficult decisions. We acknowledge that. That's why you're here. We're going to ask you to find that Matt Hoover did not intentionally or knowingly target Officer Shinners. The target was somebody else. It was himself. And when you make that finding, the law will require and the judge will instruct you that you'll have to come back and find him not guilty. And we're going to ask you to make that finding. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you.
Thank you for the opening statement from the defense, Mr. Nish. At this time, we'll take our first morning break. I instruct the jurors, when you are on breaks, of course, do not discuss the case.